Chris never expected to get married. Maybe that's why he never worried about his body art.
I have knuckle tattoos, and they say "This Life." And the title actually comes from a book called This Life that I read and that articulated a lot of my worldview. He ultimately argues that we need to reimagine society in a way that people can spend their time more meaningfully. But when my husband and I decided to get married, I was like, well, I can't wear a wedding ring on my fingers because it will make this life say this lie.
Welcome to In This Family, presented by Nexus Family Healing. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO. There are many ways that people can try to make sense of a world that can seem chaotic. They can turn to religion, strengthen their faith, study sacred texts, or they can obsessively and compulsively seek to control as much of their environment as possible through a series of actions. For others, therapy might help make sense of the world through figuring out their own mind. For Chris Stedman, all of the above. Chris is a professor of religion at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. He's the author of two highly acclaimed books, Faithiest, which sought to connect communities of faith with communities of non-believers, and IRL, about finding realness and connection in the digital world. He also created the podcast Unread, which was on several annual best of lists. He has a devoted following for his work, which is all about bringing people of different backgrounds together. Chris grew up in the Twin Cities, 3 siblings. His parents separated when he was young, and that set off a journey really to find order. It meant joining a fundamentalist Christian church as a kid. The rest of the family did not join. It also meant identifying as an atheist later in life, and it meant a lifetime of dealing with obsessive-compulsive disorder, which can have a profound effect on one's ability to function in the world. Chris is white, 39 years old, cisgender, and gay. He's married now, still managing his OCD, and he's benefited from therapy. Chris Stedman, it's so wonderful to have you on In This Family. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you describe a little bit of what kind of kid were you? How was school for you? Just what were some of the important things in your life as you were growing up?
I was a strange kid in the context of my family, I think. I mean, me and each of my siblings were all very unique. I mean, that's one of the fun things about having siblings, I think, is seeing how people can all grow up under the same roof in similar conditions and turn out so differently. And, my siblings and I, on the surface anyway, are really different. But I think as a kid, those differences felt really pronounced to me. I felt like all 3 of my siblings were athletic. They were maybe more socially adept. I excelled in the classroom, but struggled when it came to friendships. I mean, I had plenty of friends, but it just didn't feel. I looked at my siblings, and they seemed to be like more popular, more yeah. And I had trouble with socializing in certain ways. My mom just and my whole family always kind of pointed out like strange things I would say or things that were kind of socially awkward or whatever. And I was though I was really happy as a child and really kind of like colorful and outgoing and gregarious. As I started to get older, I started to feel more self-conscious about my colorfulness and I'm sort of alluding to I'm queer, and my 3 siblings are all cisgender, heterosexual, and I was very fortunate to be raised in a household that was not heavily gendered. So my mom was not interested in us being stereotypical boys and my sister being a stereotypical girl. All 4 of us had dolls. It was really important. My mom wanted us to have dolls so that we would be nurturing. And, it's funny because both of my brothers went on to play football and rugby, even though they also had dolls, just like I did. But at home, I felt affirmed for who I was. But once I was at school and engaging with people outside of my family more, I started to feel like I was not what a boy was supposed to be. Is quote, in quotes, supposed to be.
Yeah.
And And yeah, and just I don't know, I had strange, kind of eccentric interests. I was really into maps. I was obsessed with maps. I, was a geography B state finalist. Like I just was kind of a nerdy kid. I loved reading. I was always, had my nose in a book.
I'm interested in kind of what kind of books you were reading.
Young adult books. I was reading, Animorphs and just like Goosebumps and those kinds of things. But then my reading kind of took a turn, and I think honestly, I can trace it back to I remember going to the library one day early in middle school, and I was like looking for the biggest, thickest book I could find. And it was kind of an ego thing. I wanted to like carry around a really thick book so everyone could see how smart I was. Because again, the thing I was kind of validated for was my, school performance, my academic performance. So I kind of leaned into that. And so I went looking for the biggest book I could find, and it was the unabridged version of Roots,
Oh,
is what I ended up
wow.
getting my hands on.
Wow.
And so fast forward to me sitting on my bed at home just weeping as I'm reading Roots because, it started as, again, this like, um, this attempt to be a little bit of a show off, but I was very quickly humbled by what I was reading because though I had learned about slavery and the treatment of Black Americans, in kind of school as kind of like an abstract fact, reading this narrative, though it was fiction, really like humanized the experience for me in a profoundly meaningful way as a white cisgender person growing up in a very like white dominant area. I was just unaware of how different my experience was to a lot of other people's. And it was incredibly eye opening. And it kind of opened this floodgate for me where I suddenly started immersing myself in all of these books that kind of depicted these experiences of like atrocity, really. I mean, John Hersey's Hiroshima was an incredibly formative book for me, reading this on the ground account of the aftermath of the atomic bomb dropping on Hiroshima. Um, Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl and other Holocaust narratives. And I just found myself filled with all of these questions. And again, I had learned about these things in school, but they were really just presented as like these are things that happened and they were bad, but they were in the past. And reading these narratives kind of made them feel present and filled me with questions about like why it is that human beings can be so inconceivably cruel to one another. And I felt like I didn't even really have the space to or the language to articulate those questions or like a space I could ask them. And that's actually kind of what opened the door to religion for me is around that time I was invited to this after school youth group by some acquaintances from school. They were more popular kids and so I was like, "Oh, they're taking interest in me. I should go, see what they're talking about." But even though what got me in the door was like proximity to more popular people or the allure of free pizza because they said there was free pizza. What kept me coming back was I felt like I had found my people because all of the people in this community saw the same problems in the world that I did. They saw the world was broken, flawed, human beings were flawed, and they not only recognized the kind of circumstances that I did, they also offered like answers or ways of understanding why and how for these like huge questions that I had.
Hmm. Yeah. Why do you think you connected so much with those stories?
Yeah, I think I wasn't fully aware of it at the time, but I think on some level I connected with it because I knew fundamentally there was something about me that was other, just as these other groups I was reading about had also been othered in some way. Obviously, very different ways, but reading about the plight of Jewish people during the Holocaust or Japanese people after the atomic bomb dropping, or Black Americans. And, there was some kind of bit of recognition on some level that I couldn't articulate. I didn't understand at the time. And, you know, around the time that I converted, it really wasn't that long after I began to be able to put language to some of that recognition, which was my kind of emerging awareness of my queerness. I started to be able to identify that that was the thing that had kind of always felt different about me. I
And at what
mean,
age about?
this would have been adolescence, so around like 11, 12
Okay,
or
great. Great.
so.
Yeah, keep going then.
Yeah. And, You know, I didn't like being different, and so I was not happy about this development. But I had just joined this church that it turned out was actually very fundamentalist, very theologically conservative, and really very anti-LGBT. And they had a church library that was full of materials essentially saying that, this was a problem, but it was a problem I could fix through religious practice. And so, I didn't want to be queer. I didn't want to be different. And so I set about trying to do that. And that was kind of the great dilemma or irony of my conversion, is I had become a Christian because I was looking for a place to connect and belong at the time that my parents were separating, because that was also happening at this time. And because we weren't religious growing up, my family really had been like my source of community and identity. And then also I'd become a Christian because I was trying to make sense of suffering and injustice. And instead, what happened is ultimately I ended up really retreating within myself. I had this very private struggle. I didn't want to tell anyone about what I was struggling with because I was concerned it would threaten my belonging in the group. And also my own kind of personal suffering increased really significantly. I just became very withdrawn, very fixated on this issue. And so, you know, after a few years of this, I'm spending a lot of time in my room by myself with a study Bible, with a journal. I'm fasting during lunch in the Christian math teacher's classroom. She would let me hang out in there and fast. I'm doing all of these things to try to be good enough to have this problem taken from me. And I was very fortunate because as this was all happening, my mom had been, working multiple jobs at the time. She was, I think, at first happy I had somewhere safe to go after school and there was food and all of these things. But as she watched me go from this very, kind of colorful child to a much more sullen, withdrawn child, she was concerned. And so she did something that at the time I wasn't thrilled about, but in hindsight, I'm very grateful for, which is she went and kind of looked around in my room and she found a journal that I had where I was writing about this struggle I was having. And, remember, we weren't religious. We didn't go to church or anything like that. So I think my mom didn't really know the best way to kind of help me with this problem I was having. But she did something really special that I'm very grateful for, which is she went to the phone book. She called up local churches because we're in Minnesota. There's a lot of Lutheran churches. So she found a Lutheran church with an LGBT affirming minister, and she took me to speak with him. And he told me, essentially, you've been given sort of one version of Christianity, but it's not the only one. There are these others, and ours is totally LGBT affirming and inclusive. And that just opened up this kind of possibility for me that I think, I could have. And then the second thing she did was she took me to speak to a therapist, which was not something that my family really did. I never, growing up, I never knew anyone who was in therapy. I never really knew people who talked about mental health. But my mom was aware that there was an issue that needed to be addressed. And really, it was, I think it felt urgent to her because I was exhibiting symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder as a part of this struggle that I was having, this kind of immense struggle to reconcile these two seemingly irreconcilable pieces of myself. And it was just wreaking havoc on me.
Mhm.
And so she took me to talk with someone who could kind of help me. And we didn't know that there was a word for it, obsessive compulsive disorder, until I started seeing this therapist and it was identified.
Yeah, that's incredible. Okay, I want to break some of that down a little bit because I find this part of your story so rich. And I will eventually come back to the obsessive compulsive disorder for sure because I want to delve further into that. But first, um, just going back to your siblings for just a minute,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you noticed a difference between you and them, you mentioned. And you mentioned some of the social awkwardness, things like that. How did that play out with your siblings as a sibling group? Like, were they supportive of you? Did it lead to any kind of teasing? Like, how were they with your difference?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely highlighted. my differences, but
By them? Like,
by them,
okay,
but I would say we all did it to each other. I
sure.
mean, that's having siblings. We all teased each other and seized on one another's vulnerabilities. My siblings were physically stronger than me, and so we would have physical fights, and they were better than me at those, but I could use my words, and I learned to kind of seize on their vulnerabilities and their insecurities, and that was kind of my way of fighting back. Um, and yeah, we all teased each other. And so, I think when I was younger, I thought, oh, my siblings, they really, they have it out for me. It's all of them against me. Now that I've gotten older, I see we were all doing it to each other. And honestly, what's been, I think, very rich and rewarding about having an adult relationship with my siblings now, especially now that I've moved back and been back in Minnesota for a decade, is seeing actually all the ways that, though on the surface we're very different, all the ways that, you know, beneath the surface we are so similar. And always thought we were so different. And again, that I was like the outcast. And it's like, actually, each one of us felt like the outcast in our own way in the sibling group. I never knew that my sister was so insecure about how I did better in school than she did. And that, in my mind, I thought my sister has it all. And I had no idea that she looked at me with some envy. You know, um, Again, I am very, very grateful. And this was kind of an eye opening thing. I know we'll come back to the OCD, but not long after I moved back to Minnesota and I was kind of rebuilding my relationship with my family, though, I had seen them like once a year at Christmas when I lived out east, but, being able to have that kind of everyday relationship with them again. And I remember this was early on in my time back. One time, one of my brothers, and my mom and I got together to make Christmas cookies. And again, at this point, I still had this feeling of like, I'm so different from the rest of my family. I have OCD, I'm on medication, I'm in therapy, blah, blah, blah. But I remember w- kind of stepping back from the situation and observing and seeing like so many similarities. Like, am very particular about having processes for how I do things, and I like to do things in a certain order. I'm very ritualistic. This is, very connected to my OCD. And I remember watching my mom and my brother, them being so particular and things needing to be done in a certain order, and if you disrupt that, that's a problem. And I started thinking about, yeah, how my brother, that brother's wife, is always teasing him for how things have to be a really specific way. And I started thinking, and I'm like, wow, we're all that way. And for me, the framework of OCD has been useful, but uh you know it is OCD is I know, I'm sorry. I know we're
That's all right.
coming back to
That's all
this, but
right.
OCD is, it's essentially a maladaptive response to uncertainty. And, the maladaptive piece is important because we all struggle with uncertainty as human beings. We all create rituals in our lives to create order and help us, take some kind of control of the chaos that can be our lives. But OCD is when that becomes maladaptive, when it starts to kind of get in the way of things, or there's these kind of unnecessary rituals that start to like be a problem. So for me, that can look like excessive hand washing. It's like, I actually, not only do I not need to wash my hands that extra time, my hands are now getting dry and they're cracking, and so it's the maladaptive piece where that becomes a problem. But in a way, recognizing this in my siblings, and again, I don't want to armchair diagnose or put language on them that they wouldn't use for themselves, but seeing it in my mom and my siblings, it actually helped me feel more connected to them and more alike. Like, we actually all struggle with this in our own way. And it made me feel like I am not this completely different person from the rest of my family. Actually, I am a product of this group of people, and we have a shared understanding, and I can be myself around them without judgment, even though, again, we did tease each other a lot as kids, and we still do. But it's like a loving, knowing teasing. And in a way, I think what I thought was teasing about how different I was as a kid was kind of a little bit of a like, we see you and you're one of us.
You told the story about your mom helping you find a minister to speak to that was LGBTQ plus affirming. And that is such a rare gift that your mom went out of her way to find this. And she wasn't religious at this time, correct? And at what
Mm-mm.
age were you now at this point when she's helping you with this?
So this was my first year of high school, so around like 13,
Okay,
14.
so
By
this is still
so
quite
a few
young.
years,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
after it was like I had this struggle for a couple years, and then my mom intervened. So I'm yes, as you say, I'm still pretty young at this point.
Okay. And what was the struggle that you think she saw you having specifically?
She had just watched me go from being a confident child. I was raised in a family where, like, there was almost a sense of pride in not doing things the way everybody else did them. Like, the boys are gonna have dolls. The girls not going to wear pink, and like we were just again. I think my mom really made it clear, like it's actually it's good to not be like everybody else. You shouldn't just follow society's blueprint. You should step back, look at it, ask questions about it, and decide for yourself. And so, as a kid, I had a lot of confidence as a result of that because I could be myself at home. But as I started spending more and more time in spaces outside of the home, I became less and less confident. And then it went to an extreme with this kind of struggle with my sexuality and my faith, where I became extremely, self-critical and not confident at all in myself, and really questioning myself and wanting to be different than I was, and all of this. So I had lost so much of what I think had been this gift I was given as a child, and my mom just saw it. I mean, she could see that I used to be kind of unapologetically unique, quirky, nerdy, whatever, and instead I was trying to wear the same clothes as other people. I was spending a lot of time alone. And again, these OCD kind of rituals were becoming apparent. Like, if I touched my right eyebrow, I had to touch my left. I had a big thing. My OCD kind of first manifested as a balance
Mhm.
thing, where if I did something with the right, I had to do it with the left, and vice versa. And this, it was about feeling like I had no control and over anything in my life at that point. My parents were divorcing. I was queer and I didn't want to be. I mean, adolescence is just hard for everybody. I don't know anyone who would ever want to relive being an adolescent. And I was looking for a way to like find some order in the chaos. And I think for me, that is a huge part of what drew me to maps as a kid, drew me to religion
Mm,
as an adolescent,
mhm.
and that was manifested in my OCD is, all three of those things are ways of trying to like make sense of the chaos, to take the, kind of incredibly complex terrain, whether it's literal terrain or the kind of, emotional, psychological, spiritual terrain of being a human being, or, and to reduce it to something manageable and understandable, and tame the wildness of life.
So let's shift a little bit to the obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which is often commonly referred to because you mentioned that your siblings struggle with this too. And you even said that it looked like your mom has a little bit of that as well. So maybe let's go into when did you notice that you were having OCD tendencies?
Yeah. Again, it was kind of around this very formative period, obviously, because we've spent quite a bit of time talking about it. But in my adolescence, where I was struggling with my parents' divorce, with my sexual orientation, with this new, very kind of in group, out group, us versus them Christian community that had joined. Um, and I was just feeling pulled in these different directions, and feeling like, everything just felt so out of control. And again, I had had a very, um, I think, even though, my family, we struggled financially growing up, like we were not well off in that regard. I think I was extremely well off in terms of having a loving, supportive home to be a part of as a child. And so it was very jarring to go from this childhood where even the struggles we did have, like the financial struggles, my mom really insulated us from them, and didn't put those on us. To go from that childhood to feeling very, lost and pulled in all these different directions and confused, and that was very jarring. And I had no idea what OCD was, but I was self-soothing with these different tick-like behaviors, a lot of balance. I would like rub my fingernails under the other fingernails, and I'd have to do it one way and then do the other. And I knew I had to do these things, but I didn't know why I was doing them or what function they were playing. And it was once my mom noticed that I was doing these strange things, and she didn't, react like stop doing those things, or but rather was like, let's figure out what's happening here, and took me to speak with a therapist who was working with me on the religion stuff, but also was like, this seems to be OCD. And what's really interesting is, I worked with my therapist on these behaviors. I showed a lot of signs of improvement. And I think I kind of almost put it in the rear view window. I was like, well, I dealt with my OCD. Like, that was a problem. It's not anymore. And it was really I had this experience in my late 20s, early 30s, where I went through a lot of big changes all at once, very similar to my adolescence, where I was in a long-term relationship that ended. I'd been hired to build this program at Yale for 4 years, and the funding for that ended. And so I had this big job change. I decided to move back to Minnesota at that time to be closer to family. My stepdad was showing signs of Alzheimer's. And then in the midst of all that change and disruption, I had these back-to-back negative experiences where I stayed somewhere that had bed bugs. And then I also got scabies,
Ugh.
like within a few months of each other. And it was horrible, really bad luck. And it just completely activated my OCD in all of these ways. It became undeniable that I was really struggling with compulsions and rituals. And a lot of it had to do with cleanliness or contamination. It got to a point where it was undeniable. It was like I wasn't stepping on certain parts of the floor. I wasn't, I started categorizing everything in my mind as either clean or dirty. And I was like, this is really a problem.
Mhm.
And so I decided to go back to
Yeah.
therapy. We worked on that quite a bit. And one of the things that I kind of learned through that process, I also started for the first time reading more about OCD, like wanting to learn more about it. And I started to look back at my adulthood, all these times when I thought like, oh, OCD is kind of in my past. And actually it was just manifesting in these different ways that I wasn't aware. Um, whether it was like obsessively checking my email all the time to make sure that there wasn't any new crisis at work that I needed to worry about, or doing things in a certain way and thinking that that's just my routine. And so this was really kind of a time in my life where I decided this thing that I thought like was something I had and then I didn't have it anymore, actually is this kind of lifelong condition that I am either managing or not managing. And so decided I wanted to start being more proactive about trying to manage it. I live with my husband, and living with someone else, because I was living alone when this all, was coming to a fore. Living with someone else also makes your OCD more noticeable to you, because you start to recognize, wow, I have all these unspoken rules for how things need to be done, and this person's doing them in a different way. And I need to decide, can I let that be, or do I need to articulate this? And so my husband and I have had a lot of conversations about, what is kind of good validation for me and what is actually not helpful and is just validating the OCD.
Explain that a little bit, what you mean by validating for you versus validating the OCD.
Yeah. So, one example is I really fixate on whether or not the door was locked when we left our home. And, you know, if I ask my husband once, like, hey, do you remember if we locked the door? For him to say like, yes, we did, like that is one time is fine. I try not to do it at all. I try to like tell myself like it's okay. I don't need that validation. It's locked. 99% of the time it's locked, even when I think it's not. But when I ask again, a second time or a third time, that's not helpful actually, because it reinforces and what's actually helpful is for my husband to say something like, you're okay. You can sit with that uncertainty. And that is ultimately like more helpful than. And I think for him, he loves me, he cares about me. So he wants to give me the reassurance. He doesn't want me to feel uncomfortable, of course, but I need to actually sit with that discomfort and learn to make peace with it and make friends with it. And that is part of my managing my OCD.
Mhm. Were you prepared for how much the OCD would impact your marriage and the relationship?
Um, that's a great question. Because I think this is my first relationship where I was really taking my OCD seriously and like actively, proactively trying to like manage it and work on it. Um, I think it was a big learning curve for me and certainly for him. um, but I do think like anything, it that you kind of work on with a partner and talk through, like I think it has ultimately brought us closer. And I think, I get why sometimes people are scared to talk to their partners about mental health related things. They don't want to feel like a burden. They don't want to feel like a problem. But again, I would say like I feel like ultimately it has brought us closer. And, of course, because my partner's only human, I hate the moment when I ask for something like, hey, did you wash your hands before doing, he's in the kitchen or something. And I can tell that it's irritating that I've asked that question, and I hate that feeling. I hate, and he's totally valid for feeling irritated. It is an irritating thing that I'm always asking this question. But I also appreciate that he can be honest with me about that and that we can talk about that. And it's actually helpful for me to know how it makes him feel, because that is information that I use as I kind of work on the OCD. Like I want to work on this so that I can ask for that less.
Now, when it comes to, so like, let's just say the relationship with your husband, what's one of the worst things about the OCD that's really impacted that relationship that you really had to work through and struggle with?
Yeah. I mean, I think one just sort of like maybe it seems a little silly, but my husband loves to cook and is an amazing cook. And so we have a division of labor in our household. There are certain tasks that I kind of take the lead on, there are other things that he takes the lead on. I find cooking to be really challenging because of my OCD. I get really fixated on contamination. I am washing my hands between each and every step. It's a struggle for me. It like really activates my OCD. And so, we've decided in terms of our division of labor, it just makes so much more sense for him to cook, and he loves cooking. It's a way he shows love and experiences creativity and on my end, I'm kind of like, you should make whatever you want to make. Like I'm not a picky eater at all, and so that I think I'm enjoyable to cook for because I'll just eat whatever he's in the mood to make. But I think he had this fantasy once upon a time, before we really got into our relationship or whatever, of, being with someone who they could cook together. And it was this romantic thing they would do together. And it would bring them closer together and all this stuff. And so early on, I think he wanted us to do some of that stuff together. And I kind of had to explain, like, this is actually not romantic at all on my end. It's stressful and whatever. And so, I think then he was even like, well, you could just be in the kitchen and talk to me while I cook. And we tried that. But again, I found myself I was like monitoring everything he was doing. I was hyper vigilant. Is he washing his hands enough? Blah, blah, blah. Did that little bit of chopped vegetable go off of the cutting board onto the counter for a second, And so we've had to learn that it's actually best for everyone if I just am not in the kitchen when he's cooking and just leave him to do that on his own. And actually, he's learned to really enjoy that. He is a big podcast listener, so he listens to podcasts while he cooks, and it's a like good kind of daily time for him to have that time to listen to podcasts and whatever. But we kind of had to learn through trial and error, or just error, that it wasn't going to be a good thing for us. And, again, like I have this, maybe one day, this most healed version of myself will someday be able to do that with him. But I don't like begrudge myself for not being that person, and don't expect myself to ever become that person.
Well, we've talked about your mom and your husband and your siblings. What role does your father play in your life?
When my parents separated, my father had some challenges in those years afterwards, and our relationship had some challenges. I think he really thrived with the support that my mother provided, and without that support, he didn't thrive. He struggled with employment and housing and a lot of different things. There was a period in my life where he didn't feel like someone I could rely on. But he has come a long way, and as an adult, I've worked, like both of us have worked on our relationship, and we're definitely closer now. But when I was young, my mom was really like the big kind of force in my life, and really proactive in all these ways around the challenges that I had, and being supportive and all of that. So, my dad and I, like I said, we're good. We see each other, and actually, both my husband and I, both of our dads, like we do joint Father's Day with them. Like it's been fun to kind of bring them together. And the truth is, like, there was just a period of my life where we just weren't really super in each other's lives. And so it's not as if he was this extremely negative impact on me, but also, like, when I talk about and think about all the kind of formative experiences I had, especially as a, adolescent, teen, young adult, like my mom really was such a big presence in my life in that way.
I want to take a little turn here. You've spent your life thinking and writing about religion and community. And I think about your OCD and how people with religion and OCD in their lives can have what's called scrupulosity. It's also known as religious OCD, and it could look like praying constantly, repeating rituals, over confessing, feeling a lot of guilt about things that you've done. Has that ever described your situation?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was an adolescent, I definitely struggled with that. I mean, I kind of made a couple little references here and there, but I would fast, and I would pray, and I would spend a lot of time in my room alone with my Bible, and I was trying to just be like the most devout, best kind of Christian I could possibly be, thinking that like that would fix the problem at the time, which was my sexuality. Um, as I got older and I kind of processed some of that religious trauma, and had different kinds of experiences with religion, including very positive ones. I mean, when I was in high school, and I began coming out of the closet, and I was openly gay in a secular public high school, but not a particularly welcoming one. And there weren't other LGBT people around me. And at that point, like, school felt very unsafe. And then church felt very safe. It felt like the place where I could be myself and be embraced and celebrated for who I was. And so I had had these really negative, alienating experiences with religion initially, and then I had these really positive ones. And then, as I continued to study religion, I was able to kind of disentangle all of that and recognize, okay, I don't think I am religious actually, after all. And so, any of my kind of struggles with that all went away.
A lot of your work's been about bringing atheist communities and religious communities together. Is that work you're still doing right now?
Yeah, definitely. That'll always be a part of my work and part of what's important to me. That was the focus of my first book. And as I mentioned earlier, I've done quite a bit in the interfaith kind of space, in my career. And I feel very strongly that bringing people together across lines of difference, whether they're religious or other lines of difference, is essential to building the common good. We can only determine the common good by having the input and perspective of everyone of all different backgrounds. And the humanizing that happens when we come together across lines of difference and get to know one another as people, I think is essential to having a good society. I just find not only is humanizing difference important, but also like you gain so much from being in a context where not everyone is just like you, from learning from people who have had really different experiences, who see the world in a different way. I mean, even though I'm not religious, as I kind of said earlier, I've learned so much from religion that has been meaningful and useful to me. Um, in like multiple respects. Sometimes I learn things where I'm like, that's not useful for me, but it helps me clarify what I don't think.
Mhm.
Other times it's like, wow, that actually is a valuable kind of framework or story, or it's made me think about something in a different way. And I want to carry that piece of, of that forward. And, the friend of mine who officiated our wedding, my wedding is top of mind because it was not that long ago. It was in May.
Oh,
Um,
congratulations. I didn't realize it was that
yeah.
soon ago.
Yeah, thank you. Um, but the friend who officiated our wedding is a friend that I met, almost 15 years ago in interfaith organizing, and she is Sikh, and we have different um, worldviews. I'm an atheist. She's Sikh. She's religious. Um, our lives look really different. She has two young children. I am not a parent. I am very involved in like queer organizing and really involved in queer communities and find a lot of, my meaning there. Um, and yet we also like, she is someone who I have learned so much from, who has really been there for me, who has been like an ally to my communities, and having her officiate the wedding and kind of bring her own perspective was so meaningful and rich. She did um, this. We had, the ceremony wasn't religious at all, really, but there was this one moment where she drew on something from her own tradition of Sikhism that involved basically everyone laying their hands sort of on the person in front of them until like the hands reached us as the couple. And it was this kind of ritual that was acknowledging and recognizing like our connections to one another and the way that we all need one another, and the importance of a community to supporting a marriage. And she brought that from her own kind of tradition, and even though it isn't mine, it made our wedding much richer and more meaningful. And I'm glad that she brought, and I, encouraged her to bring something from her own tradition, because why ask someone to be a part of your life and or play a role in something like your wedding, and then not have them bring some who they are into that. And so, I love being part of communities that are, intentionally about bringing together people who are different, because I learn so much from the different perspectives and traditions that other people have. And yeah, that will always be important to me.
I think it is a rare gift for people to be able to hold both of those positions. And, when the readings that I've read of yours or the things that I've listened to, you seem to do such a nice job of bringing the two together. And you mentioned religious trauma. I don't know how much you have experienced religious trauma or what that means to you. Can you explain that just really quick? And then I'll get into my next point that I want to try to make with this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, religious trauma is trauma that's specifically bound up in religion or experience with religion. And often it has to do with high control religious groups, um, very kind of insular or exclusive religious groups. The fundamentalist, now that's not a word that they use, but it's clear to me looking at the group I joined as an adolescent, it was a very fundamentalist, conservative, very in group, out group, very exclusive, very much not only like we are correct and everyone else is wrong, but also like we are correct and everyone else is bad. And to be different and to be wrong is bad. And they were high control in a number of regards. And so I would say, yes, I definitely had trauma from that group that I had to unpack. But for me, a big part of healing that trauma was not having positive encounters with religion as
Yeah.
well. and being in those spaces like interfaith spaces or progressive religious communities where not only was difference allowed, but it was celebrated. And that for me was a very healing part of my experience with religious trauma.
Yeah, and I love again how you can hold both of those. And I think that that is so important to healing for people, regardless of what the trauma is holding both spaces, that there's, bad and challenges that come with it, but there's also a lot of good. And it just seems like that's such a theme, throughout your life.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I don't think I've ever made the connection until this conversation right now that I have that same approach as I was talking about earlier to my challenges with mental health, like my OCD, like to not just see the bad, but also to see the good. And that's been like an important part of my healing. I don't think I've ever connected it before, but that is absolutely been my approach to religion as well. And like healing my religious trauma has involved acknowledging and honoring the bad, but also like seeing the good and seeing that like religion, like any other sort of human experience or expression of human desires or interests or ideas, like is complex. It's not just black and white. It's not just bad or not just good. It's both. And I do think that it is a hard thing to actually live into. We are conditioned by this world to see things as one thing or the other, good or bad, but almost everything is complex and gray. And that is where the uncertainty is. And it feels safer and less uncertain to say, religion is good or religion is bad. And it is harder to accept and embrace that it is both. But but it's also freeing to do that, because then you recognize that, yeah, everything is complicated. Everything is uncertain. Nothing is just one thing or the other. And thus, like when something feels bad or hard, there are also, it's such a cliche, but it's like, yeah, the bad things that have happened to me in my life, the challenges I've had have made me into the person that I am, that I like. And I wouldn't go back and change them. Like I wouldn't change my struggles I had as an adolescent around religion and my sexual orientation, because they have made me into a person who I like being.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I just think that is, it's interesting because I don't know if I've ever made that connection, but it is, like you said, such a theme, I think, in my life. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for being on the show. This has been an absolutely delightful time to share with you and to learn from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I know that this wasn't therapy, but it was good timing because my therapist messaged me today that he's under the weather and we can't meet for our usual session.
There you go. There you go.
So I feel like I've done a lot of processing already
Good.
today. So thank you for that.
Where can people find you?
My website is just chrisstedmanwriter.com. Stedman is spelled like Stedman, like Oprah's boyfriend.
I love that.
That's what I always say, because there's different spellings, but it's the Oprah's boyfriend spelling. I am on Instagram, Chris D. Stedman. My middle name is Delos. And I use Blue Sky a little bit, but yeah, those are a few places. And then, I have a couple books, IRL and Faithiest, as well as a book I'm working on right now called Nothing in Particular. And then my podcast is called Unread.
In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization. You can learn more about Nexus and how to support our mission at nexusfamilyhealing.org. The show is produced by John Moe with music from Jeremy Messersmith. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and write a review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you next time.